let's define respiration and describe the three phases of respiration. Most of us equate breathing with respiration, but respiration includes more than just breathing. It's actually the entire process of a gas exchange between the atmosphere and then our body cells, and it includes three phases: ventilation, or what we would tend to refer to as breathing, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So let's start with ventilation. In order to discuss ventilation, there's a couple of items that we need to discuss. The first is the structure of the lungs. So the lungs, as we've seen before, are within the pleural cavity. The parietal pleura is the outer membrane of the pleura. The visceral pleura is the inner membrane of the pleura right up against the lungs. And then between the two layers is the intrapleural space. This is important to understand because as we breathe or undergo the process of ventilation, we will be discussing changes to the pleura and the intrapleural space in terms of pressure. Another important background concept is Boyle's law. Boyle's law relates two variables to each other: volume and pressure. So let's look at an example of tires in order to understand Boyle's law better. Here we have on the left a deflated bicycle tube, and on the right side we have a deflated truck tube. The truck tube is 10 times the volume of the bicycle tube. If we were to look at the bicycle tube and take it and inflate it with 1 liter of air, the bicycle tube would be firm to the touch. Because we have a smaller volume of tube, the 1 liter of air would have a large amount of pressure within that tube. If we were to take the truck tube and put 1 liter of air in it, the truck tube would only be partially inflated. Because it's 10 times the volume, there's not nearly the same amount of pressure within the truck tire tube. And so the relationship between volume and pressure is fairly simple. And this is Boyle's law, that the smaller the volume with the same amount of gas, the higher the pressure. Or if we have a larger volume with the same amount of gas, we have a lower pressure. It's important to understand Boyle's law because when we're breathing, ultimately what we're doing when we're inhaling and exhaling is changing the volume of our thoracic cavity. During inhalation or breathing in, what's happening is our diaphragm is moving down and our rib cage moves up and out due to the movement of the intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs. When the diaphragm moves down and the rib cage moves up and out, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. Because the amount of air has not changed, with the increase of volume of the thoracic cavity of the lungs, there is a decrease in pressure. To take another look at this, we'll look at the anterior view of this person's body. As the diaphragm contracts and moves down, as their rib cage moves up and out, the pressure within the lungs actually decreases. The volume of the lungs has expanded or increased, therefore the pressure has decreased according to Boyle's law. What will happen then is the atmospheric air is at a higher pressure than the air inside the lungs, and the air will flow into the lungs from the high atmospheric pressure to the low lung pressure. The opposite is the case for exhalation or breathing out. When we exhale, the diaphragm moves up as it relaxes. The ribcage moves down and in, therefore decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Since the volume of the thoracic cavity has decreased, the pressure has increased within the thoracic cavity. The pressure of the air within the lungs is now larger than it is in the atmosphere, and the air is pushed up and out of the lungs into the atmosphere. Inhalation is an active contracting process. The muscles are contracting to increase the size of the thoracic cavity. To exhale, the muscles are simply relaxing. And we'll look at this a little bit later in terms of the recoil of the lungs. If we were to graph out inhalation and exhalation, we'd come up with a graph like this. The total capacity of the lungs is somewhere between 5 and 6 liters depending on the person. But before we get into any of the technical terms for breathing, we could actually map out how much volume is being exchanged during inhalation and exhalation. So let's look at that now. Here we have someone taking normal breaths in, and out, and then taking a maximum breath in, and then expelling or exhaling the maximum amount of breath. Then breathing in, out, and out at a normal breath, a really deep breath, and then breathing out, and then normal breaths again. As you can see, the normal breath volume is only about half a liter. But we can breathe in a maximum up to approximately 6 liters depending on the person, and down to about only 1.2 liters, again depending on the person. Let's move that graph off to the side and look at each of these values here. In the end, the total lung capacity, as mentioned, is somewhere between 5 and 6 liters depending on the person. The types of breaths that we were mentioning as the graph presented itself were the tidal volume, normal, quiet breathing. How I remember this is I think of tides at the ocean that move in and out as the day progresses. And so this is the normal in and out breathing. We have a really deep breath, as we saw by this peak that moved up to the 6 liter mark. And this is the inspiratory reserve volume. And then we had the maximum exhalation, which is the expiratory reserve volume. This is over and above or down and below the normal tidal volume. The good part about this is it allows us to get more air into our lungs when needed or expel more air when needed. So tidal volume is occurring during normal conditions when we're just sitting or moving around easily. But we have more reserve volume, both inspiratory and expiratory, when needed for doing activities like running or other high energy, high demand activities. Another term is vital capacity. The vital capacity here goes from the lowest portion of the expiratory reserve volume to the highest portion of the inspiratory reserve volume. It's called vital capacity because it is important in terms of how much overall gas we can get in and out of our lungs at the extremes. Because the final volume here is the residual volume. The residual volume is a volume that we can actually not remove from our lungs under normal conditions. So even if you were to sit and try to force all the air out of your lungs as hard as possible, getting down to the lowest point of your expiratory reserve volume, you would still have approximately 1 to 1.2 liters of air inside your lungs. The reason that we have this amount of air left over in our lungs is so that our alveoli do not collapse. As we inhale, it's very similar to a balloon filling up with air. The alveoli fill up with air. And then just like a balloon, when you release it, there's that elastic recoil that squeezes all the air out. If we were to look at our alveoli, we would see that there's elastic tissue that makes up the outer portion of the alveoli. As we breathe in, the elastic tissue is stretched. And then as we breathe out, the elastic tissue recoils to a relaxed or unstretched position. As I mentioned before, inhalation is active and exhalation is passive. Within our lungs, there's fluids, specifically water. And one thing that we need to know is that the alveoli are so small that with the fluid inside, the mucus made up of mostly water, the surface tension between those molecules is so strong that it makes the alveoli want to collapse. However, we already mentioned that our lungs don't collapse because we have the residual volume left inside our lungs, and that helps to keep the alveoli open. But another aspect that helps that are surfactants. Surfactants are chemicals created by our body that interfere with that surface tension, that attraction between the water molecules that want to pull the alveoli sides towards each other, allowing them to collapse. Because we have that surfactant, it doesn't allow the attraction of those water molecules to collapse our alveoli, and on top of that, we have that residual volume of air that stays within the lungs at all times in order to keep the alveoli open. Let's move on then to the process of gas exchange. We've talked about the cardiovascular system and how the right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body, and then it pumps it out via the pulmonary artery to the lungs. This image gets a little bit busy here, but the key to gas exchange is that gases will want to move as they did from the atmospheric pressure into the lungs or out of the lungs based on differences in pressure. Gases will move from high pressure to low pressure. So if we look at the blood moving out to the pulmonary capillaries surrounding the alveoli, we can analyze each individual gas within the lungs. If we look at the blood, the PO2, the pressure or partial pressure just produced by the oxygen, is at 40. The partial pressure of just carbon dioxide is at 45. Within the alveoli, however, the partial pressure due to oxygen, because the air is made up of more oxygen than carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of oxygen is at 104, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is at 40. So naturally, the oxygen will want to move from the pressure of 104 in the alveoli to the pressure of 40 in the blood. The carbon dioxide pressure is higher within the blood, and so the carbon dioxide will move from high pressure in the blood to the lower partial pressure within the alveoli. And we have gas exchange where oxygen has now moved into the blood and carbon dioxide has gone into the lungs for breathing out. We now have a higher pressure of oxygen in the blood and a lower pressure of carbon dioxide that then returns to the left side of the heart via the pulmonary veins. The blood then gets pumped out of the heart through the aorta and moves to capillaries found within the tissues. The partial pressure of oxygen is at 95 in the blood, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is at 40 in the blood. However, in the tissue, let's say skin tissue as shown in the image here, the skin has used oxygen to produce energy, and therefore the partial pressure is lower at 40, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher at 50. And so we will have gas exchange in the systemic capillaries where oxygen will move out of the blood from higher partial pressure of 95 into the lower partial pressure in the tissue at 40. Carbon dioxide will move out of the tissue from high pressure to the blood at lower pressure. The oxygen can then be used by the cells of the tissue, and the carbon dioxide will be pumped back to the heart and then back out to the lungs for exchange and breathing it out. This is that second process of gas exchange between the outside atmosphere and inside of our body at the level of the lungs and then at the level of the tissues within our body.